Good evening. Thank you for joining us. I'm Patricia Chin, principal at Hickory Woods Elementary and co-chair of the Walled Lake Parenting Education Team. On behalf of our partners at the Lakes Area Community Coalition under the leadership of Joan Barrett, welcome to Wellness Wednesday webinars. Tonight's topic is, does my child need therapy? Our presenter this evening is Nikki O'Donnell, a master level psychologist with over 15 years of clinical experience. Nikki is currently in private practice at Viewpoint Psychology and Wellness in Commerce, Michigan. Nikki was voted one of Oakland County's top 40 under 40 in 2020 for her teen mental health initiatives and community outreach. In addition to her private practice work, Nikki is also a member of the Lakes Area Community Coalition, where she serves as the Youth Action Board leader. Thank you, Nikki, for spending your time with us. Before we get started, I just want to share a few quick housekeeping items. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on the district website and the Lakes Area Community Coalition website, as well as linked in our district weekly updates. The chat function has been disabled for this meeting, but if you have questions, you'll see at the bottom of your screen a little Q&A feature. It looks like two thought bubbles with the letters Q&A there. If you open that Q&A feature, you simply type your questions in the box and our panelists will respond either during the presentation or at the end. Thank you for choosing to spend your time with us. And thank you, Nikki, for your time this evening.
Well, thank you, Patricia. I'm so excited to be here and to talk to everybody today about our topic, does my child need therapy? To start off, I just want to say that, I'm completely biased. I think therapy can be helpful in a lot of situations and for a lot of folks and families. But I think today our focus is really going to be for those families or those parents who are just kind of wondering, I'm seeing some things at home and just kind of wondering if that's, should I be concerned, right? Probably the biggest question or concern that I have when I meet parents for the first time, whether it's in clinic or when I'm out doing speaking engagements, is they're asking like, should I be worried about this? And what the good thing is, maybe 80% of the time, 75% of the time, totally nothing to worry about. And I can kind of comfort them and say, nope, you know what, here are A, B, and C. These are some things that if these things happen, then let's be concerned. But thank goodness, maybe it wasn't as big of a concern as we thought. So that's maybe 75, 80% of the time. But what I think is really helpful maybe today is to hear, well, what about the other 25, 20%, right? What if there really are some concerns that I'm having, whether it's in the behavior that's going on at home with my child, maybe I'm noticing some changes in their mood, maybe things with school aren't going so well all of a sudden, or things are changing with their, whether it's their performance, their ability to attention, sustain focus, all of that stuff. So going to address a couple of those things. I'm going to give you guys a couple tools that I use, kind of like the insider scoop of how we evaluate in the clinic a child, the things that I would ask if I was speaking with a parent for the first time to try to determine whether or not we thought therapy would be appropriate for their child. So let's start there. The first thing that I just want to say is that when we're talking about kiddos, so we're talking from, 0 to 18, let's say, right? Let's like go through the lifespan here of our children until they become little young adults. The thing that we have to keep in mind here is their brains are changing rapidly. We see it and we can see it in their actions when they're, first born till they're 1, and we celebrate all those milestones. But the thing that we kind of neglect to remember sometimes is from 1 all the way up until right in the mid-20s, their brains are still developing. And because of that, we see all kinds of things throughout development that sometimes are like, whoa, what is that? When it's perfectly normal, or it could be something, that's like a stage. Like when we see children very, very young, right? When they first start learning to talk, but they can't actually, verbalize a lot of what they're feeling, they get frustrated and they throw tantrums. Totally normal. That happens. And then we see that kind of work itself out in older children, right? That same mechanism is happening. Their ability to communicate what it is that they're thinking and feeling and all of that, that doesn't catch up with the brain until way later. it's a bummer for us as parents because what happens is the front part of their brains in middle school, high school, that part of the brain is still developing. This is the part, unfortunately, that deals with things like logic and reasoning and all of that good stuff. So we have a problem because the emotional center of the brain at that point is fully developed by like 9. So we have a problem. We have huge emotions, and then we have very little logic, problem solving, and ability to communicate it. So that can look a lot of different ways for kids. Like I said, some ways that it's going to come across and it's going to be a concern for a short period of time. And then other things that might be, if they're sticking around a little longer, those would be the things that we'd be concerned about. With that said, here are some of the things. And I've got a couple different screen grabs to show you guys. We won't do that justice, but we'll do that in a minute. But I want to share that some of the things that if I meet a family and they're wondering, right, like what should I be concerned about? And is this a good fit? Should they start therapy? I'm going to look for a couple different things. One, I'm going to want to know, what is the biggest worry that you have as a parent? Right. So a lot of things keep us up at night as parents, I think. But like, if I can get parents to formulate into words, like, what's their biggest worry? Maybe it's, I'm really fearful. I'm really scared. The way that their mood and the way that, like their anxiety is just so heightened to the point that it's interrupting other parts of their life. And that worries me. Or, I'm seeing depression, what I think could be depression in my kid, and they're sleeping all the time, way more than normal, and they're irritable and all of these things. That will say a lot. So kind of answer that question in your head, like, what's the thing that I worry the most? And then on the other side of that, I'll always ask, how long has that been going on? Right. So if it's something that's, and here's the other thing, it's this whole global pandemic going on. So it's kind of like being in a storm, right? We're all in a storm, but it's a different storm for everybody. It's the same thing for kids. It's been really just such a challenge on them. I will say that my work clinically, clients that had, been doing well and, I hadn't seen them in a while are all coming back because this is just really hard stuff, being isolated and just all the different things that they have to deal with, and the elements of, virtual school and transitioning back, and just anxiety, worries, and all of these different things. So we got to take that into consideration as well, right? That might be affecting a lot of kids, and sometimes even kids who were doing maybe great previously, and then we kind of see all this stuff happening. That could be a thing as well. When I'm asking that question, then, right, like, how long has this been going on? I kind of have to keep that in the back of my mind as well. A lot of kids, I will say, in the past 6 months, like I said, maybe weren't seeing any issues and concerns prior, but then all of this happening, right, that can happen. Those are things that we look for. So it can heighten anxiety, can heighten depression where maybe it didn't exist before. That sometimes is that little light switch, or just that kind of cluster of circumstances and stressors that sort of just, it's like especially with kids and teens, we see this a lot too, is when their ability to cope and manage is like here, which is typical, right? Like, we're going to say like, here's normal for most middle school, high school kiddos. And the issue is, okay, they can cope with most things. And then some things, they're still working on it. Because remember, that front part of the brain, not until they're in their 20s is that going to fully develop. But then sometimes what happens is they'll get a life stressor that maybe requires this much coping ability. And then we got a problem, call it the gap. And that's where I will oftentimes see families pursuing therapy, is because, man, we got to bridge that gap somehow. And with what's been going on in the world, right? Like, we've had some stress here, and, through lots of ways, some kids have coped and managed, and they've kind of bridged their gap themselves a little bit with family support and all this stuff. And some, it's just not happening. So again, that's another thing that we look for, right? Like, sometimes this is not happening because of anything a parent did or anything, nothing like that. This is just the kind of the nature of things when we're dealing with high levels of stress. So I'll ask about symptoms. I'll ask how long they've been going on. I'm looking for types of behavior changes. Sometimes it's going to be one of two camps, right? I'll see kids who on the outside and the inside are not doing so hot, right? They look like they're doing bad, and all their behaviors match. They're feeling really bad, and parents can communicate that. they're not the ones I worry about as much, though I'm concerned about them. And obviously, like, we address that. But the ones that I worry about more are the kids that have a lot going on inside, but look totally fine on the outside, right? That's the one that's challenging, because a lot of kids, particularly kids that are really high achieving, have this ability to kind of have a high tolerance for stress, and they're managing and they're managing and they're managing. And then all of a sudden it kind of gets to a point, and we might not know as parents what's going on. We might say nothing was changing. They were kind of saying that the stress was higher here and there, but it wasn't dramatic. They weren't crying every day, or some of the more the things when we think of depression, maybe that we would think of weren't happening. So that's another thing, that even if, and this is where I think something like the PHQ-9. So I have a screen grab for everybody. We'll also post this when we post this video, for you guys to see. The PHQ-9 is a tool that you can find online. We're going to share it right now. This is also something that's used in all of the pediatric offices. This has been a huge movement in the past 5 years, to get this into the hands of pediatricians, because it's just a really great screening tool, to be honest. This is a tool that we use, the patient health questionnaire, to screen for depression symptoms in particular. It's also going to kind of pick up some of those marginal anxiety symptoms, but primarily I will use this when we're looking at, okay, are the symptoms we're seeing a certain collection of symptoms, are they enough to justify, like us really saying, okay, we got to move forward with some treatment here. And this is where I think it comes in handy. If you've got a kiddo that looks totally fine on the outside, but you're still kind of worried, run through some of these questions. What you're going to do, you're going to rate the behaviors or the concerns on a scale, right? So not happening at all, happening a little bit, and sometimes happening more often than not, and then, happening quite frequently or all of the time. And after kind of going through those, if you're finding that you get to the end and those gray boxes, you'll kind of see them on the right-hand side, those are the higher level symptoms. So those ones are the most concerning. But if we get down to the end and we add up our score there at the bottom, and we see that, okay, all right, this number is anything above a 7, then my attention is peaked. That is a more clinically significant, I will say. Obviously, some kids are going to have periods of time where they're, again, we talked about the part of their brain that's so developed, that's the emotional center. So there's going to be a good portion of time where maybe they feel some of this stuff, but we're not that. We're looking for this collection of symptoms. And so anything up to maybe like a 6 or so, like below that, but if you're getting closer to that, that's where my concern is. And so I'll have parents fill that out for me, or we'll kind of dialogue it through over the phone or through email, and then kind of determine, like, okay, these are clinically significant. Like, let's take a further look. This doesn't diagnose anything. This is not here to, I don't want anybody to get, freaked out if they're reading through and they're getting really concerned. This is just a screening tool. And to be honest, when I meet with families and I'm coming up with a treatment plan for families and kids, this is what we look at to see if we're making good progress or change, right? Like, what does the intervention need to be to target these symptoms? The next one that I think is super helpful is something called the SCARED inventory. And this is one that probably isn't, people aren't as familiar with. We don't use this in the pediatrician's office. This is much more of a clinical, like, therapist-y thing. But I think it's so helpful. So this one we use, or this one would be more appropriate if we're seeing primarily anxiety symptoms. And this is a pretty in-depth, it's two pages, kind of the same format, right? Like, are these symptoms happening? Not at all, sometimes, more than half the time, or all the time. You're kind of deciding those things as far as frequency, but it's breaking it down a little bit more than just like, am I having worries or not, right? Some things that we wouldn't necessarily think of as anxiety actually show up as anxiety. Things like irritability can actually be the way that anxiety presents in a kid. Again, remember that emotional part of the brain is so well developed, and those emotions don't have a really a great way to get out. So sometimes it can come out sideways. So irritability and all of those things can sometimes be found in there. And you'll see as you read through some of the symptoms as well that we look for when it comes to anxiety in particular, that it's not just worries or feeling overly stressed. We're talking about a lot of different things. This is something that's disrupting other areas of life. So there is the scary inventory. Again, this is not a diagnostic tool by any means. Even for me in the clinic, when I have families fill this out or we do this together, this is strictly to help me better help your kids. So, this is going to help us see where the severity of symptoms lie. And then also, where does our treatment plan need to be so we're super effective? And again, we can see over time. So this is the other thing. When you go and start therapy, I think one of the things, especially with kids, is to, be able to feel like you've got a pretty solid treatment plan. Like, here are the symptoms. Here's the issue that's going on. Here's the gap we want to fill. And here's the kind of the plan of how we're going to do it. And so most therapists will say, okay, here's kind of my thought on that. Maybe we'll use some cognitive behavioral therapy, some mindfulness. We're going to try to, bulk up those coping skills. We're going to connect to, get them connected within their community, sort of those supports, all of that. And then we're going to see, this is what we're looking to see. We want to see at the end, maybe in X amount of time, we want to see that these numbers are getting lower. So it's really satisfying, even for the teens that I see, for them to see over time if things are improving. It's also really nice because if those numbers, right, if those aren't moving, or if it's getting worse, if those numbers are getting higher, then to me as a clinician, that right there tells me, okay, clearly we need to do something else. We need to take another direction. And so that's kind of the point where maybe we bring in, another person into our therapy support team, right? Whether it's psychiatry, or OT, occupational therapy, just all kinds of different things that might kind of, when we go in to do a treatment plan review, we might say, let's tweak that just a little bit. So I think those are some of the primary things that I love to share with families, just to kind of get them thinking. I think the one thing that's really important is just as you read through some of the symptoms, as far as the mood questionnaire, right? Like, are there changes in, are the things that kids were interested in, and they no longer are finding interest or pleasure or joy in those things? Has that changed? All of these kind of nuanced things, just kind of a really good conversation starter, I think, with kids as well. Because if it's something that you're noticing or you're wondering about, I think the number one thing that a parent can do is just ask, right? Just like have an open, honest conversation, like, hey, I listened to this thing and I got this, this questionnaire about depression, and I was looking at it and I just thought, like, maybe we could talk about it. Like, maybe, like, have you felt any of these things? Like, I really just want to make sure, that that we're in this together, and, that together we can work through whatever it is that we need to work through. So I think that is just a huge benefit to parents to even have a conversation, even if it's one that ends with a kid like rolling their eyes, like, whatever, I don't want to talk to you about this, mom or dad. We can't control that. It's going to happen, but don't let that be a deterrent for you, because that action of even just showing that interest or care, sometimes, like, they're not going to show it on their face, but like inside, that feels really good to a kid. Again, kids are not the best, until they're in their later 20s at knowing how to communicate their thoughts, feelings, and needs. And so what they're feeling inside and their behaviors on the outside, they often don't match, right? I think of really like anger, right? The way that depression or anxiety can come out in anger or irritability. So sadness, right? That we would usually think of as tearfulness and, just like that kind of a vibe on a teenager might look like angry, stay away from me, this really angry armor, when really inside it's something quite different. And then with kids, what ends up happening is, like, what they're really wanting, they're not getting, because, right, the armor says something different and we're not mind readers. So we're kind of working to just bridge that gap. What can we do? What the conversations we can have, even just things like, resources, whether it's watching, a webinar on what to look for or what sorts of things a therapist would kind of ask if I was going to, start therapy, or wondering if that could be a good support. The last thing I'll say with that, before we get to some questions, and I have some as well, is that there's never like a bad time to even, if you thought at any point, or if a child has said like, I think I might want to talk to somebody, even extending that, hey, would you like to talk to somebody about that? Because regardless of how close of a relationship that we have with our kids, there becomes a point where, they're still our kids, and that dynamic is happening. So sometimes that outside perspective, or just that, that offering to a child, like, hey, we can talk to somebody. We can like, like enlist the help and support of somebody who's not me. Doesn't have to be me. Like, I just want to make sure, you're getting what you need. And it's interesting sometimes, especially with the way I think mental health and there's sort of a shifting in kind of like to go to therapy and what that looks like for kids and teens is shifting a little bit. Like, it's not looked at as like, you're crazy or you did something bad. It's more of like yeah, that's kind of like a thing that people do. Like we go to the dentist to get our teeth cleaned. So even just starting that conversation, I can be really helpful. And it shows to kids. It's really just modeling to kids, like, I care, and I'm willing to have these conversations with you. So hopefully that targeted a handful of the questions that that families and folks may have. I do have a couple here, and if any other come through, please feel free to post those. But I do have some commonly asked ones that I thought I could kind of talk about. So one of the ones I get very commonly is, my kid doesn't want to do school. They're just not doing it. What do we do about that? We're concerned. Should we take them to therapy? What do we do? And so obviously that's a really tough one, right? Because with kids, we have wishes and controls, the things we wish we could control, and the things, in their world that we actually can. And this list is a lot shorter, this list is a lot shorter than this one. We can't, there's a lot that we can't, it's not we can, force them to do the things. But sometimes the first thing that I'll encourage is like, let's do some investigation. It's not often that a kid's not doing the school or the work or all of that, just like for no reason. Like, underneath that behavior, sometimes we can kind of like dig a little deeper and see what's going on. Sometimes it might be rooted in, maybe there was an issue. And again, we talked about like the coping gap, right? Maybe they ran into a problem, whether it's with, a class, or they weren't doing well, or a social situation or something. They encountered something that required this amount of ability to cope and deal and problem solve, but they only have this much, right? So the best thing for, in a kid brain to do is just not do it, right? Like, let's just avoid that thing maybe. So that's one thing I think that when I'm talking with families, again, if that is an issue with either with school resistance or just, a challenge there with getting kids motivated for the work, we really look at that, like, all right, what's going on, and what can we do here? Maybe to help with either being, what supports can we put into place? And if there was an issue, can we address that? Because again, that whole like communicating what I think and feel and feeling it, like that whole process, not great for kids. I will say there are some kids that are just wonderful communicators, but they're in the minority, or they're just, in the minority. There's not many that are happening. The majority of kids are going to have a tough time with that. Because again, it's just that it's a whole brain thing. They're just, they're on their way to developing all of those reasoning skills, but they're not quite there yet. So that is my biggest tip there when it comes to the school, issue. But the next one that I will often get asked is with questions regarding anxiety. I have a lot, and I will say, Walled Lake School District, I have 2 kiddos in the school district, and I just think, I think that our district does a beautiful job of providing educational challenges and choices for kids. And I think we end up with a lot of really high achieving kiddos, which is wonderful. But we also kind of end up on this other end. So I'll end up seeing a collection of kids who are dealing with issues surrounding perfectionism, right? If I can't do it the best or perfect, I'm not going to do it at all. Or if I can't do it, if I can't get an A, then I failed, right? Like all or nothing kind of thing. And sometimes we find that those issues are rooted in anxiety, right? Anxiety is when the brain is getting all of these messages, right? That there's a stressor, and then it has a false alarm. It's sort of like alert, alert, alert. I don't know what to do with this. Clearly it's a threat. Clearly this is too much to handle. And then we get that gap that exists in there. So one thing in therapy, often when I see a high achieving kid who's really perfectionistic and just is having a very difficult time accepting anything other than that, particularly with everything that's gone on with online school and the pandemic, and like it's been a different challenge people have had to reroute, is developing those realistic expectations, right? Sometimes they have these expectations that I'm like, my goodness, like that's a lot to expect out of the circumstance or out of the facts. So sometimes we can even see anxiety existing in kids in that way. So that's another good one to keep an eye out for. Like I said earlier, the kids that sometimes worry me the most are the ones who look okay on the outside. Sometimes their friends will kind of be clued in, like, or have a concern or voice it because maybe they're hearing, maybe they're kind of saying every once in a while, like, I'm exhausted and whatever it is, I want to give up, or just little things. Sometimes they'll reach out in those little ways, but again, it concerns me more because on the outside they look just fine. So asking those questions, even if you think it's fine, there's nothing wrong with asking the question. How are you feeling? Like, have you ever had anxiety? Have you ever thought maybe you had symptoms of depression? Like, here are some. Even asking a kid, have you ever felt, or do you feel suicidal? Do you feel like you would have you ever had thoughts of hurting yourself, or do you have thoughts of hurting yourself? It's scary as a parent to ask those questions, but I tell you what, it's not going to in any way make them all of a sudden have those ideas. Not at all. I mean, they're seeing these things in the media. They know about these things already. But what it will do is it really communicates to them, like, wow, my parents care, that they're asking these hard questions. And sometimes it'll be surprising, maybe not, right away when we kind of extend that, like, hey, like, are you okay? Like, I'm having these concerns. Sometimes initially we might get the eye roll and the whatever, it's fine, mom. But later it might be like, because we kind of extended that invitation, we might see kids kind of come around and say, you know what, I think I have been having a hard time. So, I think if nothing else, the main things to take away here today, using a screening tool like the PHQ-9 or the scared inventory are a great way to see, what kinds of things are therapists looking for when it comes to the major players of anxiety and depression in kids and teens. And then if I'm seeing that, oh, wow, okay, we're actually like, there's a few on here that are actually kind of true for my child, that absolutely 100% of the time, you can't go wrong, kind of like better safe than sorry kind of thing, right? So even if it's just reaching out to a therapist in the community or myself to ask those questions, that's completely appropriate. I think having that understanding of sort of a little bit of what we're looking for, but at the same time, you really know your child also. And then, reaching out when you have questions like that, if you want clarification or, anything like that. I will say with everything that's gone on, I've really seen kids, whether it's from therapy or community connections, kids are benefiting right now more than ever with having support or just feeling connected and hooked in somewhere. Some kids, can get that if they're, and really thrive in therapy in that way. Other kids, if we can get them hooked into something, if it's participating in some way in the community, even now if it's virtually, those things are very important. Those are some of the protective factors that, I think they're also really valuable. So I hope this was helpful. Like I said, we will post both the PHQ-9 and the scared inventory so that everybody can see it and kind of scan through. And if there are questions, we'll make sure that we have resources and all of that good stuff on the webpage as well as contact information for myself. So thank you, everyone. And thank you for the Lakes Area Community Coalition and Walled Lake Schools for having me.
Well, thank you, Nikki, for the fantastic information. I know as a mom, there were some moments there you were speaking right to me, I think, and some really useful tidbits for me to take away and kind of think about. So I hope that our other folks watching felt the same. And I didn't see any questions pop up through the presentation. I think you answered a couple that sort of came to my mind, and hopefully that came to the other folks watching their minds as well. So we are going to be respectful of timelines and say on behalf of the Walled Lake Parenting Education Team and the Lakes Area Community Coalition, thank you again, Nikki, and thank you to all those that were able to spend your time with us. As a reminder, the presentation is being recorded or has been recorded and will be available on our district website and the Lakes Area Community Coalition website. And as Nikki said, we'll get those handouts on there so that you can take a look at those as well and contact information in case you have any questions. And we hope that folks will join us again for our next Wellness webinar, Wellness Wednesday webinar. Thank you so much and have a great evening.